Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel, and today we're going to be looking at the 10 best decks in the format right now as we head into Peoria Regionals. Peoria Regionals is of course this weekend, so it is coming up very, very quickly, and I wanted to look at what I think are the 10 best decks in the format right now. There's actually a pretty big variety of decks you can play right now. Now, for each spot, I've kind of clumped each archetype together. Obviously, there's multiple different versions of an archetype right now that are doing well, so I've kind of just combined them all together, because I do think that all the different archetypes are really good together. Instead of just doing them separately, like 4 different spots for different Charizard decks, or 3 different spots for different Lost Box decks, stuff like that. I've kind of just all clumped them into one spot, but I hope you are going to enjoy the video. If you're new here to this second channel, make sure to subscribe down below. We are on the road to 9,000 subs, and leave a like if you go on to enjoy. What do you think of the top 10 list? I unfortunately will not be in Peoria, but I will be watching from home, so I'm hoping to see some pretty cool stuff be played. But let's get into what I think are the best decks in the format right now. All right, starting off the list, we have Arceus Giratina, or Arc decks in general. Arceus has been on the decline recently in terms of how popular and how playable it's been, really because of stuff like Lost Zone Giratina, and I honestly think that Charizard has never really been good for Arc decks, but Arctina, in my opinion, is still a deck that is still holding on to dear life. If I were to play any Arc deck to Peoria, I would probably consider playing Arceus Giratina, because I think it's the most straightforward and consistent Arceus deck. And since each spot is designated to each separate card, I haven't been able to include, each archetype in its own spot. Because number 10 easily could have been, like, Lost Zone Charizard, and then number 4 could have been, like, Arceus Pidgeot Charizard. But instead, I've all clumped them into one spot, which is why I did have to put Arc on the list. Arc in normal top 10 list maybe wouldn't have made the list, but I do think that Arceus is fine right now. It is not the worst deck you can play. You can obviously build your Arceus deck to how you see fit. You don't have to play Arctina. You can play Arc Duraludon, which I don't think is as good right now, but I do think Arc Dura has some merit, because it does have, obviously, like, an insanely good Lugia matchup, and there's 2 different versions of Lugia running around right now, so you have, like, double the opportunity to just beat Lugia with Arc Dura. The only problem with Arc Dura is you have to then figure out how to beat anything else in the meta. There's also Arceus Aerodactyl Klefki, which is starting to see some play right now, too. That's another decent Arc deck, but ultimately, I think the Arc decks are now at, like, the bottom of the list if we're not counting each different archetype separately. I think Arc is definitely at the bottom of the list. I hope that some kind of Arc deck can do well in Peoria. I'm a huge Arceus fan, but right now Arceus is just kind of on the downswing, but it does still have merits. I think Arctina, maybe if you want to play the Superior or Leafeon, has a pretty good matchup into Charizard, and I do expect Charizard to be pretty darn popular in Peoria. Charizard will most likely see some play in Peoria, and having a deck that has a decent matchup against it isn't bad. Obviously, with Path and Grass attackers, you might have an easy time walking over Charizard. And then, of course, you can also play Flying Pikachu if you want to maybe have a better matchup into stuff like Chien-Pao and Lugia. The problem with Arc decks, again, will ultimately be the Lost Tina matchup, and I also think that your matchup against stuff like Chien-Pao and Miraidon are pretty bad, too, depending on what you tech in your deck, obviously. But Miraidon and Lost Tina are 2 matchups I think Arc is always going to struggle with, but I definitely think Arceus isn't in a bad spot right now, and it's probably just at the very bottom of the top 10. Next up, we have Mew. Now, Mew is certainly still a great deck, and I actually think that Mew is still in a fine spot right now. The only problem with playing Mew is how popular Charizard is right now. Now, Charizard, you can argue, is not the best deck in the format, but I actually think that we're going to see a lot of Charizard in Peoria. Personally, if I was going to Peoria, I probably would not touch Mew with a 10-foot pole. Even though I think Mew is actually a great deck right now and has a pretty good matchup spread, I think the problem is just how popular Charizard is. Mew does have a very bad Charizard matchup, and obviously with Spiritomb and Drapion kind of falling out of favor, Charizard is now huge, and that is also a pretty good anti-Mew card. And I really do think that Mew is kind of a flimsy deck right now. I do think that it's strong, and I think it actually still has, like, a good Lugia matchup, a good Miraidon matchup. I think it's actually got a lot of good matchups right now. I think the only problem is, ultimately, it's just the popularity of Charizard. And if Lost Tina wants to tech in stuff like Spiritomb in their deck, obviously Turbo Lost Box will still play Drapion, which is also still a bit of a problem for Mew. Mew still has a lot of obstacles to get over, and now that I think that Charizard is one of the best decks in the format, I really do think that it hurts Mew, and I think Charizard is going to be very popular in Peoria. There's a pretty good chance you can hit 3 Charizard decks as you're playing Mew and immediately be knocked out of contention for day 2. So I don't think that Mew is the safest play for Peoria, but I wouldn't be surprised if a few people played it and did well with it. If, of course, you are a Mew believer and somebody who mains Mew a lot, I definitely wouldn't mind playing the deck, and I wouldn't, mind seeing it go far, but with how popular Charizard, it is definitely a very scary deck to play. We do see this catcher build of Mew seen some play in the online tourney scene. The fusion build is probably still the best way to play, because Meloetta does help a little bit against Charizard. I do think that Judge Path is still going to be very important to play within Mew, as you probably need a way to kind of stop Charizard. I've seen some talk of like playing Grabber within Mew, so you can Grabber the Charizards away and put them to the bottom of the deck so that they can't use Rare Candy Charizards. There's a few different ways Mew can adapt to the format, but it is still a bit of a risky deck right now in the format, especially with how popular Charizard is. But if you just dodge Charizard, I mean, Mew is just a great deck, and it has a great matchup spread. Though will say Drapion is popular right now. There are still some big dark threats in the format like Drapion and Tyranitar, which both see play in two different builds of Lugia, which is very popular too. So again, bit of a risky deck, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a couple Mews do well, because it's still one of those decks that can just squeak in and have hot runs. Next up is Chien-Pao. I think Chien-Pao is actually a pretty good all-around deck right now. I don't think that it has like any super auto-loss matchup in the format, and I think that's actually a really strong deck right now, especially with how popular Charizard is right now. That's the selling point behind playing Chien-Pao, in my opinion, is just how popular Charizard is. I think Chien-Pao has a great matchup into Charizard. Any way, you can beat Charizard by just blowing them up every turn with, Chien-Pao makes it a very good attacker in that matchup. I think thanks to, the Cologne Greninja plays, you have a good time into Lost Box and especially Gardevoir. So I think Chien-Pao is a great deck right now in the format. It feels like a pretty safe play to have, and not a lot of people really know how to play or beat the Chien-Pao deck, and I think that the Bibarel version of Chien-Pao from Pittsburgh, in my opinion, is the best way to play this deck right now. It gives you the most options, the most lines to play. It leaves you with only single prizes in play if you really want to go down the route of kind of trying to counter stuff like Miraidon. I think that if you just know how to play Chien-Pao properly, know how to sequence it, know what you're doing, I think this deck is actually genuinely a pretty strong play for Peoria, and I wouldn't be surprised if a couple Chien-Pao got pretty far within Peoria. I think it's a great deck, and it has a good Charizard matchup, which I think, in my opinion, is the selling point behind playing this deck, is because you can just immediately beat Charizard. Your opponent goes Rare Candy Charizard, all right, 6 energy Chien-Pao knockout, Rare Candy Charizard knockout Chien-Pao, okay, another Chien-Pao 6 energy knockout again, back to back, and it's just a pretty easy deck. And again, if you know what you're doing, you know how to pilot the deck correctly, I think this deck is genuinely a pretty strong archetype, and I wanted to include Chien-Pao. It's just not the most popular deck right now, which is why it's a bit lower on the list, but I do think it's a deck that, if enough people played it, it would probably be a top 5 deck, to be honest. So it's definitely a strong archetype right now, and Chien-Pao is definitely a deck that I would consider playing for Peoria myself if I was going, because I think the deck is genuinely strong and has a lot of good matchups right now. Next up is Miraidon. Now, Miraidon, I think right now is decent, and that's just because of how popular it's going to be. It's definitely just one of those decks that people play just because it's, Miraidon. It's fun, easy to play, easy to win games with because of how strong getting a turn 1 knockout is right now. And I think that Miraidon will still be popular. Obviously, the addition of Mew is a huge buff to the deck. There are a few ways people are playing Miraidon. There's Miraidon with Zapdos. There's Miraidon without Zapdos. There's obviously Miraidon with the Flying Pikachu, Miraidon with the Pogo Zapdos. I do think that Miraidon has a few different ways to play right now, but I think that Mew EX is a big boost to the deck, and I think Mew does give Miraidon a lot more value in a match because you do have a very good attacker with Mew, and Mew does help a lot of different matchups. I think that Miraidon is good. My issue with Miraidon is you have a shaky Charizard matchup because Charizard, once it gets to the point where it KOs your Vs, you're going to struggle to KO them. Yeah, you have the ability to KO one Charizard, at least with your Raichu. You're going to struggle to KO at least a second one. I don't know how you're going to get back-to-back 6 energy. Your best bet is to try to use Mew EX to try to clean up the game on a Charizard by doing 330 damage, but I do think that Miraidon overall is a pretty strong archetype right now, and definitely something that I think is going to see a lot of play. It's a popular pick by a lot of people. It's a very straightforward and fun deck to play. It definitely seems like this deck has a very big cult following right now, despite a lot of people claiming that it's a mid deck. And apart from having a bit of a shaky Charizard matchup, I think Miraidon is still a solid deck, and wouldn't be surprised if we saw a few of it in Peoria do well, because at the end of the day, it is Miraidon. It's going to do well because it's Miraidon. And with the addition of Mew, it does get a bit of a boost, and I think Mew is a huge, valuable upgrade to Miraidon. Next up is Rapid Strike. Rapid Strike is, oddly enough, in a pretty good spot right now in our format. It has a good matchup against the Lost Zone decks, we all know that. I also think that Rapid Strike isn't too bad against Charizard. I mean, Charizard is definitely beatable when they have a lot of low HP Pokemon in play. Not to mention, Rapid Strike is a deck that always likes to control the board and doesn't have to immediately just take knockouts every single turn. And against Charizard, I mean, you can control the amount of damage it does. I think Rapid Strike has a lot of potential going into Peoria. It's definitely a deck that I think a lot of big players might play because it seems not like the sleeper deck, but a deck that is kind of underrepresented, and I think we'll sneak in and do really well. Rapid Strike is just very strong right now in our format, and the only shaky matchups it has is Mew, but Mew is kind of on the down low right now due to how popular Charizard is, right? So that's huge, and on top of that, Lugia being popular does hurt it a little bit, but I think that Inteleon can still beat Lugia. It's not like an auto loss. I think Colorless Lugia is maybe a bit more beatable than Single Strike Lugia. If you're playing against more Colorless Lugia, you're going to have a better time. The one thing that some people might argue about Rapid Strike is how it's not as good against Mew, because now Mew's a thing and Mew kind of beats you. Not really, though. You got to remember, Mew can't one-shot Urshifu if it copies Gale Thrust, or even Rapid Flow, so it's not that big of a deal. And again, if you just play well enough and you know what you're doing as the Rapid Strike player, I think Rapid Strike is a powerful enough deck to do really well. And I think that its matchup against Charizard isn't bad. I think it's got a good matchup spread across the board against Guardy, against Lost Zone decks, and of course, a good Miraidon matchup too is also good to boot. But yeah, Rapid Strike's great right now, and definitely not the sleeper pick, but more of the underdog pick for Peoria. And don't be surprised if we see a couple Rapid Strike do well. Personally, I wouldn't play it. I think it's a bit too much of a big brain deck. Having to play this deck for 9 rounds in best of 3 would probably make my brain melt, because it's so much thinking and thought that has to go into each and every turn that I probably wouldn't play it. But if you're somebody who is good with it and knows how to play the deck and is down for all that, definitely play Rapid Strike, because it's a great pick. And if you just keep it in good matchups, dodge all the Mew, which again, I think Mew is kind of on the downswing right now. I think it's a great pick. And if you just know how to pilot your deck properly against Lugia, I think you're probably going to be fine and can definitely get day 2 pretty easily. Next up is Lost Box. Now, Lost Box, I think, is really, really strong and really popular. And that's the thing. Lost Box will always be a popular deck because people just really enjoy playing it. Now, there's 2 different ways to play Lost Box right now. I think both of which are very valid. First off, we got the turbo build of Lost Box here using the Dragonite, Raikou, and potentially the Drapion. Whether or not you want to respect Mew is up to you. But Turbo Lost Box is definitely the strongest and most popular way to play this deck. And I think that it's still going to be very strong within Peoria. Turbo Lost Box has a pretty solid Charizard matchup. And if you really want to make the Charizard matchup even better, you can play a grass attacker like Shaman V or Tropius. And then all of a sudden your Charizard matchup becomes even more winnable. And with how popular Charizard is going to be, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if we saw Turbo Lost Box, you know, do pretty well. It's still just a very strong deck in the format. It has great matchups, and it's just Turbo Lost Box at the end of the day. It's going to be very popular. The other version is, of course, Kyogre Lost Box, which is also going to be pretty strong. Now, I don't think it's going to be as popular as Turbo because Kyogre is harder to play. I do think Kyogre, though, is a very strong deck right now within our format. Now, Kyogre is debatably not that great against Charizard because you cannot use Kyogre against Charizard due to Charizard's terrestrial effect, but it's still a very strong deck against Lugia, and with how popular Lugia is right now, Kyogre's still good. And with how popular Miraidon is, I can see Kyogre doing really, really well in Peoria. I do think a few top players are going to be on Kyogre, which is going to be a very big deal going into this weekend. And yeah, Kyogre Lost Box definitely is going to be very strong too. Now, if I were to play a Lost Box deck, I would probably stick with Kyogre because I think it is definitely the strongest one and the one that has the better matchup spread. But I would maybe debate playing something like a Shaman in the deck to just make the Charizard matchup a bit more winnable. Kyogre's not as good against Charizard because they just won't put like Pidgeot in play. They'll just put Charizards in play, which you're going to struggle to knock out really effectively, and I do think Kyogre is probably still the best way to play Lost Box in total, but I do think the Turbo build is going to be more popular and more straightforward. Not saying the Turbo build is bad, I'm just saying that Kyogre does have an edge over Turbo, but I think Turbo's still better, and it's not as taxing on you because Kyogre obviously requires a lot of thought to pilot properly, whereas Turbo, you don't really have to, think as hard as you do with Kyogre. But yeah, both builds I think are very strong. Wouldn't be surprised if we saw Kyogre get really far within the tournament again. Same with Turbo Lost Box. I think it's just always going to be popular. You definitely expect to see a lot of big players on Turbo. Whether or not they're playing, what attackers I have is up to you. And definitely expect a few big players to be on Kyogre because I think Kyogre will definitely go far in Peoria. It seems like a safe play for Peoria, and Kyogre is definitely going to be very good in Peoria. Next up is Lugia. Lugia is looking pretty good now in our 151 format, all thanks to the addition of Mew EX. Mew really does upgrade Lugia because it gives you another really strong attacker, especially in Mirror and against Giratina. Now, there's 2 different ways to play Lugia. There's the single strike build, and there's the colorless build. Both builds, I think, have a lot of potential, and both have good and bad traits about them. The thing that I like about the single strike build is its raw power that it has. Tyranitar is a very strong card, and Tyranitar is good in a ton of different matchups. The downside is Colorless Lugia has a pretty rough Charizard matchup, and that's one of the things that throws me off from wanting to play Colorless Lugia is its Charizard matchup isn't the greatest. Even with the addition of Mew EX, I think the matchup is still pretty tough, not to mention Cobalion, in my opinion, just isn't the greatest card to help in that matchup. So I think this deck has a weak Charizard matchup, which is the first thing that throws me off from wanting to play Single Strike Lugia. But its raw power is just really good. It also just has a better matchup into other archetypes, and that's one of the benefits. And I think it beats Mirror in the Colorless matchup. The Colorless deck has a bit of a better Charizard matchup. You can play more one-prizers like the Radiant Charizard, the Snorlax, and of course, Mew EX becomes an even stronger attacker in the Colorless build due to how strong it really is. I think that the Colorless build is probably the safe way to play it, or the way to play that I think people are going to really gravitate towards due to how popular and dominant it is right now in the online tourneys, but I still think Single Strike is really good too. Single Strike has a better Colorless matchup. Like if you get paired against Lugia and you're against Colorless, I think this deck has a very easy matchup against Colorless Lugia. I guess they have a lot of Mews they can trade with your T-Char, but I think the matchup is still fine in my opinion. Colorless Lugia does feel a bit slower than the Single Strike build, and it doesn't have as big of beat sticks like the Snorlax and the Charizard and the Weird are the best you have. Compared to Tyranitar, it's a little hit or miss, right? I think Colorless Lugia is still very strong, though. Turning Lugia into a main attacker, having access to the Snorlax. Mew's really good. I really like the idea of playing double Mew within Colorless Lugia. I think double Mew has some potential within the deck, too. And I think that Colorless Lugia is a very powerful archetype right now that you definitely should not sleep on. But Single Strike's also good. If you want to play a very safe deck and you're very familiar with Single Strike, it's not a bad play. The only downside to play Single Strike is, again, I think that its matchup against Charizard is pretty abysmal. And that's the one thing that holds me back from wanting to play Single Strike myself, is I don't think its Charizard matchup is too good. But I think the deck is still very strong, and I think both builds Lugia are going to be very popular in Peoria. And that's the thing. Going to Peoria, you probably want to play a deck that can beat Lugia, because there's two different variants right now that are very strong and popular, so you want to make sure your deck has a good matchup into Lugia. Next up is Lost Tina. Lost Tina is just kind of the deck right now that people like to play because it's good, and a lot of people assume it to be the BDIF. I think this deck obviously has its strength, and it has its weaknesses. I think one of the big weaknesses, it's kind of a clunky deck. It can sometimes be very awkward, but when Lost Tina draws the nuts, it is extremely powerful and really hard to beat. I think the thing that makes Lost Tina so good is that it has a great Charizard matchup. I mean, your Charizard matchup is really, really good. Like, you can even play a Grass Attacker to make it, like, even better. But yeah, Lost Tina is just great against Charizard. And with how popular Charizard is expected to be in Peoria, Lost Tina definitely seems like a pretty good play for Peoria. Lost Tina does have a few weaknesses. I think that its Lugia matchup gets even worse now that Mew's a thing, because now you have Single Strike and Colorless Lugia, with both kind of have great answers to the Tina. Though I will say, though, that Giratina can tech Temple of Sinnoh to try to improve the Lugia matchup, which personally I would play Temple in if I played Tina, just because you kind of need to have that advantage against Lugia, though Temple isn't as good against Colorless Lugia, because they don't care about the Temple being in play. So Single Strike, definitely you can have a good time into. But yeah, Tina's just really strong right now, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a lot of Lost Tina in Peoria. It's still kind of like a safe deck, though it does get a little bit weaker thanks to Mew's popularity. It's still a powerful deck, and I think a lot of people will play it again. When this deck sets up and it draws well, Tina is very hard to beat, and it still has a great matchup spread right now. And having a good Charizard matchup, I think, is also a very attractive thing about Lost Tina. So definitely expect to see some Lost Tina in Peoria. It's still going to be played, still going to be popular, and might still be a very strong deck. And of course, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, Charizard. Now, going into Pittsburgh, I said Charizard is mid, it's not very good, and I was kind of right. It didn't do that well in Pittsburgh. It kind of underperformed. But ever since Pittsburgh, heading into the very next big regionals, Charizard all of a sudden is one of the best decks in the format. How did we get here? Well, there's a lot of different ways to play the deck. Now, Charizard still has glaring weaknesses. It still isn't great into, like, path-heavy decks. You still have a pretty bad Giratina matchup, and I think that your Lost Box matchup can be tricky, too. And, of course, Charizard is kind of easy to tech against. I mean, if you want to just play a Grass Attacker in your Lost Zone deck or something, you can. But Charizard is just a very powerful and aggressive deck right now, and I think that's what makes it so strong. And the different versions of it, I think, really do give it some validity in the meta right now. So the main kind of first way is to play with Arceus Pidgeot. This was the original, version of it. Arc Pidgeot is still solid. It still has the advantages of having Arceus, and your setup is a lot easier thanks to Star Birth. The deck does have some problems. You do have a lot of, low HP, well, I say low HP Pokemon, but 280 HP Pokemon in play can be easy for your opponent to prize map. You might they might just knock out one Charizard and get KO Arceus Pidgeot to win the game. So if I were playing Arc Pidgeot, I would look into maybe incorporating like Chair's Care something in the deck to try to beat any deck that tries to knock out your Arceus and Pidgeot on the bench. But Arczard, I think, is going to be probably the most popular way to play it. It's the most straightforward one, the one people are most familiar with. But there's also the Arvinzard build, the one that won over in Brazil. This build actually is getting a lot of attention right now, and I've seen it actually win quite a few different League Cups over the past little bit that it's been legal. Arvinzard does have a lot of strength. You have the ability to abuse Penny, so you can take off your weak 2-prizer and then just kind of leave your board with Charizards and maybe a Pidgeot, which isn't that bad. When your opponent has to go through a bunch of Charizards, it can be tough. You have the Mawile if you want to play the Mawile to tech for the Guardy matchup. The Lost City is also very strong. Arven is fantastic against like Path because Arven is literally a vacuum, so you have 4 Arvens to get rid of Path, so it's a bit of an easier time into like those Path-heavy decks that try to counter Charizard. You have the Radiantzard, and maybe if you want to play the Entei, try to beat any grass attackers like Superior or Leafeon. So I think Arvinzard is pretty good right now. I think a lot of people actually would argue it's the best way to play the deck. And I think Arvinzard is strong. It does have some power. Its potential is good. It has some answers to its counters, and this deck does have the ability to, take away your low HP Pokemon so that you can just kind of leave your board with just Charizards. Arvinzard does seem like a very strong deck, and I wouldn't be surprised if Arvinzard had a good showing in Peoria. And then, of course, we have Lost Zone Charizard, another deck that is getting some steam. There's also people that would argue this is the best way to play Charizard because you get access to a bunch of one-prize Pokemon on your bench. Instead of having your bench clogged up with a bunch of 2-prizers, you have a bunch of 1-prizers in play. You also gain access to Cramorant and Sableye, which can really help out Charizard in some awkward situations. The downside of the Lost Zone build, you don't really have control over the game like you do with the Pidgeots, because Pidgeot, you can easily grab Boss and Iona every turn if you want, and kind of basically just, you're always in control of the game, right? The Lost Zone build, you don't feel as in control of the match. You're kind of still digging for your stuff. It feels like a bit of an inverse Lost Tina deck, but it's still a decent archetype nonetheless, and I think if it draws well, it's good. I mean, it's still not hard to get Rare Candy Charizard turn 2, thanks to the ability to draw a gajillion cards a turn with Comfey, Colressing, Radiant Greninja. And then we have the Gallade build. Now, this build is, some people would argue it's also pretty good, or some people would argue it's the weakest way to play it, because you have these low HP Pokemon in play like Kirlia that can get picked off by Sableye. You don't have any, comeback potential with, Sableye or anything like that. But this build does have its strength. I think being able to control how many Charizards you can play down at once is really good. Having access to a really good draw engine is nice. It's almost the same thing as Pidgeot. Gallade, a lot of the time Pidgeot's getting you supporters. Gallade does the same thing. It's not a 2-prize liability. Reverse Lungy does open up the door for some cool tech cards. I've incorporated Luxray in my Gallade Charizard deck. I've even tried out different other options in the deck. I think that the Gallade builded Charizard is also very strong, and seems kind of decent too. So I think all these Charizard builds are going to see play. And that's the thing. I mean, with 4 different ways to play Charizard right now, it's going to be popular. It's going to make up a lot of the decks in the meta just because of the different options the deck has. I mean, the 4 different ways to play it means that there's going to be 4 different ways that you might run into Charizard. Your one day or one round, you might flip over, your opponent's going to play Galladezard, or the next round, you're going to play against Arczard or Lostzard. So Charizard is going to be popular, and I think you need to have a good matchup into Charizard or have a game plan into the deck at Peoria due to how popular it's going to be. Despite whether or not you can argue it's going to underperform or not, it's up to you, but I think it's going to be popular. Despite it being a good deck, it's still probably going to be popular, right? I think that's going to be the main takeaway. The deck definitely is rising in stonks right now. A lot of big players are on it. It's winning a lot of League Cups. I've seen it on Twitter a lot. There's 4 different ways to play it, which means that it's going to be popular in 4 different versions, so expect to see a lot of Charizard in Peoria. And if you're somebody that's playing Charizard, maybe look into options for how to beat the mirror match, depending on what version you're playing, obviously. Finally is Gardevoir. I think Gardevoir is a very good deck still in the format, and it's just a deck that I think a lot of people don't really, I mean, they're not thinking of it or not caring about as much as other decks like Lost Zone, Lugia, and Charizard. It kind of feels like it's in the back of people's mind right now. I think Artie is still just an all-around great deck. It has great matchups. Its Charizard matchup actually isn't that bad, in my opinion, due to the fact that you have these really strong blow-up options. And, I mean, if you just trade well into Charizard, if you know how to play Gardevoir correctly, know when to time your collapse stadiums, know when to play Iono, know how to sequence the deck properly, Gardevoir is an insanely strong deck right now. And I think it's still good. I think that his Charizard matchup is still 50-50. If you want to tech in Penny, you can. Or, if you're playing a Charizard, literally just don't bench Greninja. But yeah, no, Gardevoir is great. I think it's a very strong deck, and I really do think Gardevoir is going to be a very powerful archetype in Peoria. It's going to perform well. A lot of top players are going to be on it. You already know a couple of them off by heart probably by now. Yeah, Gardevoir is a very good deck, and I think that his Charizard matchup isn't that bad. Yeah, I think it's a great deck. It's very powerful, very strong, gets the job done, and is still going to be great in Peoria. It's really just in the back of people's minds right now. I mean, I think a lot of people going to Peoria are just thinking of stuff like Giratina, Charizard, Miraidon, Lugia, obviously, and nobody's really thinking of Gardevoir, and I think that's going to give Gardevoir a pretty big advantage right now heading in to Peoria. So definitely expect to see some Gardevoir in Peoria. It's a very powerful deck, and I think a lot of big players are going to play it, And whether or not they tech in Mew EX or not is, kind of be a decision, or they just kind of stick with the simplified build that we've been seeing with the vacuums, the double reversal, the forest, maybe the Lumineon, whatever tech card guard is going to play right now. But there you have it. Those are the best decks in the format right now in October, heading in to Peoria. Hope you all enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think of the list down below. There might have been some other archetypes maybe left out. I mean, some honorable mentions, I guess, go to like Palkia VSTAR. Maybe a control deck could do well, something like that. We'll have to see what happens in Peoria. I'm excited for it. I mean, with the new set coming out, there's hopefully going to be some spice. Maybe somebody's going to play some cool, spicy deck from 151 that we haven't seen before, and it'll do well. I'm excited to see what gets cooked up in Peoria, and we'll see how the meta looks going into it. I will, of course, have my meta breakdown video later on this week on the channels. Hope you all ready for that, and I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.